What is up, nerds? This is Trip, and you're listening to Homebrewed Christianity, the #1 super nerd theological podcast on the interwebs. That's right. We try to bring you the best ingredients from the academy, theologians, philosophers, scholars of religion, and such right into your earpiece. And today, we are joined by evolutionary psychologist Robert Kurzban. He is the author of Why Everyone Else is a Hypocrite, Evolution in the Modular Mind, and The Hidden Agenda of the Political Mind, How Self-Interest Shapes Our Opinions and Why We Won't Admit It. We had a blast talking, all right? I'm just telling you. So one of the things to look at, this is part of a larger series on religion, science, intersections, and such. And this episode, we talk about evolutionary psychology, his understanding of the modular mind, and then how it applies in contemporary cultural, political situations, some religious ones, what motivates decision-making and logic, and how taking an evolutionary framework to think through a lot of the different tensions and cultural assumptions around a heated and anxious and conflictual culture can give us a new perspective for engagement, for understanding, for progress. And so it's a fun conversation. I really enjoyed talking to Robert. He was not only clear and insightful, but kind, generous, and interacted with a number of questions I had, from a more religious context. And as someone who's not religious, he was extremely generous, thoughtful, and even reflective about, his own life situations, experience, decisions, and such that, I think when you get done, you're going to say, I think this guy's gained some wisdom in life and processing things. So thank you, Robert, for joining. If you're listening to this podcast, you enjoy it, it's your first time, obviously you should subscribe so you can find out more, listen to other episodes. If you're a regular, thank you. Tell your friends, share the brew. And if you're wanting to join our, an online reading group and such, which is something we do a lot here at Homebrewed Christianity, for those that want to venture with a digital community of compatriots into thinking deep about different issues, we're doing one right now. I'm doing it with Dr. Thomas J. Ward, who is a philosopher of religion, a theologian, around open and relational theologies. Open and relational theologies are ones that understand the process of time as genuine, meaning like no one, including God, knows the future is settled and determined, and in relational, meaning all things are not determined and some causally closed and determined system. So what is it like to think through science, philosophy, religious questions, and such in an open and relational perspective? We're reading a number of different thinkers and from across different perspectives, tackling different topics. If you want to join, go to openandrelationaltheology.com. What was that? Openandrelationaltheology.com. We'll be doing it for the next 4 or 5 more weeks. But if you're listening to this later, you can go to that same website, and I'm sure there's a way. You can sign up right now and get access to all 6 sessions, and you'll get invited into a group of people that are continuing to discuss the questions, topics, and things that are available. So yeah, there you go. That's what I'm talking about. Openandrelationaltheology.com. A few things before we jump in just on the horizon is, what's coming, right? Winter is coming. That's right. Winter is coming. The Game of Thrones final season is starting soon, and we're going to have Game of Thrones week to get prepared here at Homebrewed Christianity. I know that you're saying to yourself, Trip, this is a podcast that deals with scholars of religion and philosophers. And like today, our episodes with an evolutionary psychologist. Like, what does that have to do with Game of Thrones? Well, one of my favorite podcast communities is the Bald Move podcast. Super amazing pop culture podcast. And Aaron, one of the co-hosts of the Bald Move podcast, wrote a book with Anthony LaDon, who is a New Testament scholar at United Theological Seminary. And they have a book called Gods of Thrones. Volume 1's out. Volume 2 comes out in April. So I said, that's the perfect reason to connect my nerdiness and reflecting on religion and philosophy with pop culture in the Game of Thrones. Anthony came on the podcast. We recorded it. It was so good. He said, I should introduce you to Aaron. And Aaron helps me wash dishes all the time because I listen to their podcast. So I was like, yes. So what are we doing? Game of Thrones week. Soon and very soon, we will have 2 episodes that week around Game of Thrones. One with Aaron introducing Game of Thrones, the questions on it, getting pumped about this next season. We even talk, since both of us are professional podcasters, about podcasting and all that kind of stuff. And then Anthony and I talk even more in depth about like Game of Thrones and pop culture as like a super nerd who is also a PhD in religion and such. They're both great conversations, tons of fun. And I say that because now is the perfect time, if you are out of the Game of Thrones loop, to start binge watching to get ready for the arrival of winter that is coming this end of April. Yeah, that's when Game of Thrones is returning. You got to get ready. And you know, I know some people, they've been resisting to watch Game of Thrones. It's not necessary. Join the fun, join the excitement. And yeah. So anyway, here's Robert. We're talking about evolutionary psych. Remember to check out his book, The Hidden Agenda of the Political Mind, and Why Everyone Else is a Hypocrite. Both fun text to read, considering the density of the topics. Enjoy, and make sure you visit me at tripfuller.com. Trip with 2 P's, because 1 P, that's only halfway there. Peace.
Hello, everybody. This is Trip, and it's time to get a little bit nerdy because we're going to be talking about why everyone else is a hypocrite and not you. That's right, listener. You are absolutely not a hypocrite, and a large number of people are, in fact, kind of politically crazy and don't make sense unless they agree with you. And those are predicaments that we're about to figure out wonderful solutions for. Psychologist Robert Kurzban is on the podcast. And how are you doing all the way out in Pennsylvania?
I'm doing great. And first, let me just say thank you for having me on today. Thank you very much. I appreciate the opportunity to chat with you today.
Oh, definitely. So maybe a place to begin is where your own academic career began. Like, what was the question or topic that so energized you? You said, yeah, I guess I'll do a PhD in evolutionary psych.
Yeah, so my story is that I began as an undergraduate as a biology major, and I was super excited about biology. And then 2 really important things happened. The first one is that I discovered that organic chemistry met at 8 o'clock in the morning. And the second thing was that I discovered that there was a just beginning group of people who thought that evolution and the ideas of evolution by natural selection could be applied to people and their social behavior. And to me, that was such an exciting idea. And it was sort of just mind blowing to me that was a new field. And I kind of fell in love with the discipline right away. My interest in biology was about behavior, and then to discover that these amazing principles of evolution could be applied to people. It was pretty much just a one-way path ever since then.
Mm-hmm. In growing up, were you always interested in science and evolution in particular?
I absolutely was. I used to read books by Stephen Jay Gould, and there's an irony there because Gould, while he stimulated my interest in biology, he turned out to be a pretty big critic of my discipline. And so, they always made fun of me in grad school. My former advisor, Lita Cosmides, used to call me a Gould lover, mostly tongue in cheek. I think that he added tremendous value. He got a whole generation, or maybe even generations, of people just like me interested in science and biology. And so even if he and I disagreed in the latter parts of our respective, in his career and then the beginning of mine, I obviously don't hold that against him.
Mm-hmm. Well, I had a very strong interest in science early on. And if I could have done mathematics a lot better, I'm sure I would have done physics, just because cosmology seems like what nerds do if they want to do philosophy these days. And I grew up in a context where evolution was just assumed. So it wasn't until I went to college at a much more conservative religious school I saw people just freak out about the concept of religion. And what made me think of that was Gould, because of the concept of non-overlapping magisteria. And when you get to something like evolutionary psych, it actually enables scientific accounts and theories around things like religion or other different social phenomena.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. And I think that many people like me, we sort of resist that idea of Gould's, and we sort of feel like one of the amazing things about the theory of evolution by natural selection is that when you apply it to humans, our ambitions were not limited. We did want to sort of explain why people had the beliefs they did, including the sorts of beliefs that Gould was talking about. And so again, that was one of the reasons why I love the agenda so much, is that it really sought to explain so much. Maybe it will be able to, and maybe it won't. But I really admired the fact that in principle these tools could be applied so broadly.
Mm-hmm. And one of the things that I think it helps people get an idea of what's going on in evolutionary psych is the way it deconstructs the kind of dominant notion culturally of the self. So like when you hear humans start talking about themselves in very good first person thoughts, or people reflecting on what it means to be the self, what things pop into your head that are immediately obvious from your studies that most people won't even have a thought about?
Well, I mean, I think that the big lesson is just that you got to think about what exactly we mean by it and whether it's there at all. There was just a recent book out called Why Buddhism is True that sort of wrestles with this notion of the self and places all of that kind of Buddhist wrestling in the context of science, in particular this evolutionary science. And I think that's exactly right. I mean, I think what that points to is the fact that all of us just sort of assume that there's somehow an us in there somewhere. But no, very few people have sort of said, well, wait a minute, is it a little guy? And if it is, how does that guy work? And what does it mean to have a sort of a central piece of identity or whatever? And I think that's one of the big messages. And in many ways, this goes all the way back to Freud, right? So like many people think that Freud got a lot of stuff wrong, but one thing that he sort of started to point to was that it's not just one thing. Now, he thought there were three. Many of us think that number is far too small, but there's like lots of different stuff going on in your head. And that, I think, is one of the big messages of evolutionary psychology, because it sort of forefronts what's called the modular approach, the idea that you got to break the mind down into components.
Yeah, and one of the things about Freud and Nietzsche and Marx and any of the kind of masters of suspicion is the way in which their theory brings to the surface or awareness false consciousness in some sense, that, like prior to their theories really going mainstream and people, everyone's Marxist even if they don't know it, right? Like you see a TV preacher saying God might want to help me for the money for my third plane or whatever, and you all of a sudden start thinking there's motivations going on in him you don't know. And so like I wonder if there's I have a couple Lacanian friends, and they really don't like evolutionary psych, and they're allergic to it precisely because it starts to think, talk, theorize about the unconscious, right? And to try to think through what's active there. And your presentation of the modular brain, the first time I ever saw anything was where you used the smartphone as an example. And maybe you can introduce the concept of the modular brain as a way for us to at least frame conversations about all the hidden or not always conscious parts of us acting within.
Yeah, well, that's great. That's a great question. Like all academics, I'm going to start out with a caveat, which is just to say that, we're always restricted by the metaphors of our technological time. And so, when I talk about the smartphone, other people do, it's with the recognition that, there's some pieces that are analogous and then some pieces that are not. And so it's always going to be an imperfect analogy. But I think the piece that, for me is so helpful is that, smartphones assemble lots of really specialized kind of software packages, apps basically that have relatively narrow jobs. And that's the crucial piece of the analogy, is that the mind sort of brings together lots of different systems which have narrow jobs. So you've got vision, you've got the language system, you've got episodic memory, so in other words, and you can think about those in the same way that you can think about apps, in that they have a purpose. They were designed for something. Now, in the case of iPhones, it was whatever the Apple engineers wanted to do, whereas in the context of minds, it's what, evolution has selected for. But that's sort of, to me, I think that's an important idea because it illustrates that you've got to sort of have lots of different pieces with doing special jobs, but then the system has to somehow work as a whole as well. And that starts to dig into this notion of consciousness too. So, because in some sense we can kind of quote unquote only do one thing at once. That's not exactly true because, our heart's going and our vision is working, but, we do have this intuition about attention. And there, I think, there's other aspects of the analogy that are going to pass over as well.
Mm-hmm. And so if you're thinking to the Robert Wright book you mentioned, is mindfulness is in the practice where you learn to set your notifications and tracking information or something like that. That's how you have intentionality with the modular concept.
Right. Yeah. I love that. I love that idea. So my New Year's resolution actually was to try to make my own practice a little bit more regular. And I absolutely love that kind of approach because it does seem like all of us, especially the modern world, are subject to both metaphorical and literal notifications, right? Mm-hmm. So something pops to mind, either spontaneously or something tries to capture your attention through your phone or your browser or whatever it is. And I think there's something very deep there. And I myself am trying to incorporate those lessons. I think that scientists all too often wind up with their head too far in the clouds. My friend used to say, science is where the rubber meets the sky. And I think what we want to do is bring it down a little bit and try to, at least I'm trying to apply it to my own life.
Mm-hmm. Now, one of the things that comes up in both your books is the way in which morality or concepts of virtue and things have functions in the way we select groups and the way we identify what's right and wrong and things like that. And in a lot of our internal monologues about virtue and morality and our public dialogues around it, the strategic thinking that you highlight isn't out for display. So can you kind of unpack like how human beings as individuals and in groups use the concepts of like morality and the virtuous and the good for means beyond their own end?
Yeah, so I think that one thing I want to say is that I think many people, when they hear the word morality, they kind of think about, all the good stuff like rainbows and butterflies and cooperation and Mother Teresa. So just to be clear, when I talk about it, most of the discussion that I've had about morality has been sort of intuitions that X, Y, or Z is wrong, and people who X and people who Y and people who Z should be punished. And so in that context, you could start to see how morality could be used strategically, because if I want to stop other people from Xing, then, I might try to get everyone to think, Xing is wrong and people who X should be punished for it. And that to me is the key piece of morality that I think has been sort of underappreciated in lots of these discussions. Mm-hmm. And so then you can start to see the strategic sorts of uses for it. So, if I kind of want to live in a world, so my friend and collaborator on one of the books you mentioned very generously a couple of times now, Jason Whedon, he talks about the strategies that underpin abortion views. So he sort of says the real thing that's going on with abortion views is that there's some people who kind of want to prevent, people from having wide amounts of sex with different partners. So if you're in a monogamous relationship, it's good for you to live in a world in which everyone sort of stays within their monogamous relationship, right? Because then your partner is less likely to stray. You're basically recruiting other people's morality to keep your partner in check. That's the kind of strategic notion that we have in mind. How can I deploy my morality and try to spread it to accomplish the kinds of goals that make the society better for me, worse for you?
Mm-hmm. And so when you talk about the hidden agenda of a political mind, like what is it that's being hidden that will kind of shock people on different sides of political debate?
I think that what's hidden from people is their own self-interest and how much their own political views are driven by their self-interest. One of the things that we wanted to do was bring this into the lab. So we had people learn the rules of a particular game. We asked them, as a moral matter, what should people do in the game? And then we actually gave them a role in the game. So they knew if they were, player one or player two, and there were different kinds of things. And after they were assigned the roles, we asked the same question. What we discovered was that even after like 3 minutes or 5, whatever it was, as the subject played the game, they changed their views on what the ethical thing to do, of course, in line with where their self-interest lies. Now, we don't think people knew this. Maybe they did and maybe they didn't. But the point is that we actually think this is going on all over the place, that people don't really know where their views are coming from. And the reason that's important is that audiences are much less likely to be persuaded by moral arguments if they perceive that argument being driven by the speaker's self-interest, right? So if I say, you know what, I'm a rich person and I think that government's moving money from rich people to poor people is a bad idea because I want to stay rich. No. Right? The way you put that is, look, I'm a person and I just think that it's coercive for governments to take anyone's money because it's a property right and government should defend property rights. That second thing sounds much more persuasive than the first thing, even though it could very well be that your motives have more to do with the first thing than the second.
Well, you just don't want to get caught talking about the 47%. That's when
no, that's true. Yeah, that would be a bad thing. And I recommend checking the room for recording devices before you talk about them.
Before you're really clear and direct.
Yeah.
So when in that situation, how do you see self-deception functioning for the individual?
Yeah, so my view on this is pretty similar. I like to just make sure I signal that Bob Trivers, the famous biologist, kind of had the same sort of idea. And it goes like this. He basically says, look, if I know why I'm doing something and that reason is kind of a bad reason, then it could kind of leak out into the world. So if I know that what I'm doing is wrong, or I know that I have a false belief that's good for me to have, then you can kind of detect that false belief on my part. But if I deceive myself into thinking that something or other is true, then it's more persuasive. And so you sort of keep the truth hidden so that other people don't sort of catch on to what's really going on. Now, I should also say that people define this term differently in different contexts. So, I think that like so many scholarly debates, there's a little bit of a tempest in a teapot here because it depends on how you define the concept. But for me, I think this kind of propaganda piece is what explains it. It's that it's a way to keep information hidden so that it doesn't sort of leak out into the world.
Mm-hmm. Well, and I do think there's a sense that you always tell the most virtuous version of yourself story to yourself. Right?
Yeah, I think that's right. And I think that what's going on there is that it's not just to yourself, though, because, and again, this is sort of the Trivers view, is that if I keep telling the story to myself, then when people ask me about it or people sort of judge me about what they think, then they're likely to believe it too. That's the key piece, is that, I think that these stories that we tell ourselves wind up having a role in the narratives in our conversations with other people in our behavior. And I think that's the key piece.
Mm-hmm. So how would you describe the current political landscape as an evolutionary psychologist?
Oh, wow, that is a tall order. I mean, I assume you're talking about the United States, right? The American political context.
Yeah, unless you want to talk about fascism across the globe, who knows? Whatever you're comfortable with.
Yeah. So I'll just summarize politics internationally. No, I'll say this: like, I think that the analyses right now that are basically saying the American political system has turned into something that looks much more like a pair of tribes at war as opposed to a set of ideological battles that are being fought. That seems right to me. And you can see that in the change of complexion in the Republican Party, right? So, tariffs and growing deficits, anti-immigration. These are all things that historically in the United States for the last 30 years have been associated, or maybe more, with the Democratic Party. And so you get this ideological shift in the party because really what's going on is that it has become more or less a battle of the band. That is, a coalitional or a tribal kind of conflict, as opposed to what a more ideological one. And this is also changing the complexion of people's political views. Like, it's weird that Republicans, as a whole, have started endorsing some of these protectionist policies, and the reason they are is not because they've changed their views on protectionism. Is that that's where the party has moved. And so, and I think there's lots of different reasons. We can talk about the individuals involved. We can talk about other kinds of forces, but that has both polarized and homogenized the American political scene, which I think ultimately is probably a bad thing. But I also think will eventually, I think it's likely to be relatively temporary, like who knows.
Hmm. Well, I think one of the challenges that individuals, are dealing with, is, especially if you're not on the extremes in a sense, is that feeling of, oh, just disgust about what's going on, right? So, like, I have friends that just, I'll show up to vote because I don't want the racist team winning, kind of thing, but they really just don't have any interest in being informed about it or hearing about it, because what can I do till I can vote? And then you have those who spend all day on the internet cultivating outrage and working each other up and that kind of thing. And vice versa, right? That kind of stuff happens on both sides. When you see the way the tribalism is being impacted by technology and the other changes kind of going on in culture today, how does that impact the way you see things going forward?
Yeah, super interesting question. I think that I agree with some of the views that some have endorsed about how social media has turned us into has turned the world into these kinds of like echo chambers. So one of the most powerful phenomena in psychology, in my opinion, that is active today is the so-called confirmation bias. That people are likely to seek out information that confirms their pre-existing views. And we can talk about, how widely applicable that is and how strong it is. But I think that what's going on there in the current political context is that that's operative, and people are sort of looking out for confirmatory views. And that dictates the media they consume, who they follow on Twitter, what news sites they watch. And those news sites themselves are going to be motivated in virtue of the sort of the market forces to give the viewers what they sort of want. Which is also to confirm their pre-existing views. And so I do think there's something to this notion of a positive feedback loop in the modern context. I mean, back in the day, you're too young to remember, but there used to be 3 major networks and pretty much everyone got their news from ABC, NBC, and CBS. And so you didn't have the possibility of this kind of an echo chamber because everyone was watching Dan Rather. Now we can talk about whether or not he was, as dispassionate as one would want, but you can go your whole life now, pretty much as it currently exists, without consuming a media source that everybody else is consuming. And so we're all being exposed to the kind of information that our group likes and wants, and that information is feeding back in. And I think that I have no idea what the right solution to that kind of a problem is, but it seems very deep and profound to me.
Mm-hmm. Well, what kind of impact do you think the drive to a kind of growing sense of loneliness, like we're averaging less total friends that you interact with physically, that you're intimate with, like sharing your life. We're involved in less organizations where you gather just as humans in space, be it civic or religious organizations or even political action committees and things like that. Like, how has the way our technology economy and such moved us into more isolated spaces impacted this kind of concepts around tribalism and really doing politics when humans' faces and stories aren't front of mind?
Yeah, I think that's a super interesting question. And, I'll start out by saying I don't know, but I'll give you some guesses. And I think one of the crucial pieces is similar to the prior point, which is that as our social networks have diminished, the diversity of views that we're exposed to in person have diminished. And I think people have underestimated one piece of that, which is that people, as you probably know, are much more likely to be, let us say, piquant as the distance between them and another person goes up, right? So this is why, if I'm posting anonymously to a YouTube video or something like that, but one might be aggressive and mean and nasty. And yet, if you put that same person in a room with the person who made the video, I can almost promise you, one-on-one, there's just no way they would resort to the kind of language they resort to. They would, take a strong position. People, once they meet in person, tend to be much more gentle in these transactions. And now that intersects with your question, because to the extent that we are being exposed to fewer people in our social networks and the views that we're exposed to are homogeneous, we don't have these opportunities to be in peaceful, calm, one-on-one settings, or maybe one-on multiple settings with people who have views which are different from our own. And I think that really runs the risk of undermining some kind of discourse. And I think it has the risk of making our own views a lot more extreme than they otherwise would. And so I absolutely think these technological pieces are really important for understanding the sociology of the current political context.
Mm-hmm. Well, one of the challenges I think that that I wonder might be a bit like, how do we frame it best, is for those places where people gather and interact, where there is difference there. Um, is there a positive contribution to not bring up and deal with all the issues that are important? Let's say climate change or something like that. That we're eliminating life for in future generations and such. Is it, if we wanted to get to community being able to act on it, is there a positive sense that we want to bring the culture's level of anxiety down, where it's not a one party issue, right? Because I look at our country and go like, well, if you just like science, it's really hard to think you're picking between parties unless you like science and are rich and want more of your money back, like that. And if you're in a civic organization, or like when I coach my kids' sports teams, or at a faith community or whatever, I think there's this tension of, do we want to use this time together to go like, hi, like if God made the world and loved it, you should probably not choke everyone out or whatever. Or will that just raise the anxiety of the people that don't agree with you, and then they're never open to changing your mind, and maybe helping lower the tension ultimately is more fruitful? Does that kind of make sense? Like, I feel like there's a question as to what the actual means of change, of getting to new consensus is.
Yeah. And again, I feel like that's one of these things where I'm just going to say, I don't know the answer to that. I think it's a super important question. I think it's really tough. I mean, I think that the question of climate change in many ways is tough, because it's really the world's biggest public goods problem, right? So for many years, centuries now, we've understood public goods problems where everyone's better off if they don't cooperate, and we're all worse off if no one does. And in many ways, climate change has that property, right? And so it's not surprising in some sense that this has become an incredibly vexing problem to solve, because it really is the one thing for which, the public goods hurdles rise the highest. In terms of whether you want to turn the temperature metaphorical now up or down on this debate, I don't know. I mean, what I would say is that it seems to me that the urgency has started to sort of sink into a broader swath of the American population. And I think ultimately, probably that's a good thing. And, I would go back to sort of where we started, which is, I think that one of the lines that has made this a little bit more persuasive across the political spectrum have been the increasing number of pieces about how climate change is affecting individuals, right? So people who are on the coast, people who are subject to, like people are starting to see these as having tangible effects on their lives and their families and friends' lives. And that to me has seemed to be starting to move the needle just a little bit. Is there, I do think that people are just super attuned to their self-interests, shockingly. And as they start to see issues impinging on that self-interest, that's when they seem to want to get engaged.
Mm-hmm. So when you look at the way self-interest is connected to community affiliations, does that help make sense of how there are millions of people of faith who work against what seems to be rather straightforward statements from the one they think is divine? Like, to me, I think that's one of the questions that consistently dumbfounds me, where you have a homeless first century Jew executed by the empire because of inclusive work among the marginalized, advocating for the redistribution of wealth and to the recognition that power and possessions ultimately corrupts one's well-being. That guy is kind of the the gathering point for a whole bunch of people who kind of do the opposite, right? Like when I think of hypocrisy, immorality, and being good at spotting it as a progressive person of faith, that I'm always sitting there going, why can't you just switch religions? Like, it's not that hard. So like, how could you kind of help open up that frustration that I think a lot of people, religious and not religious, have?
Yeah. Super interesting question. Yeah. when I kind of try to back it all out, because I often find this as puzzling as you do, the behavior from people who seem to endorse philosophies that are so at odds with my perception of who they're supporting and what they're supporting. I really do actually, go back to the modular view, which is to say, one of the things about religious doctrine and religious text is that it seems to me, as someone who does not actually have much background in either religion as a personal matter or comparative religion, but is that there's a couple of things you can say. One is that, people are able to find textual justifications for almost anything, it seems to me. And that's because there's so much religious writing with no constraint that it be mutually consistent. So you can always find something to support your view. And the other thing is that it's really hard to figure out any kind of principled way to talk about what should be the top of the pyramid, like what should be the first priority. So even if we agreed, here's 10 things that, as a religious person, I should bring about X, Y, and Z, to the extent that those things are somehow contradictory, then we have to put one above the other. So I think in some cases, here's the way I think this is what's really going on, is that you have a person and they have their own self-interest and they have their own sorts of agenda. And they say, well, I'm going to use religious ideas to justify my position on these top 2, 3, or 4 things. And when I'm trying to talk to myself or others about why that puts me out of step on the other topics, I just say, well, those aren't as important. I don't want to. I don't know how too deeply you want to get into religion here, but like if you think that, for example, abortion is ending a life, then it seems to me you would be justified in saying, look, until that one gets figured out, I just have no interest in making sure that the other things that matter to me and to a deity or to other people, those don't merit any of my attention because this is the top of the pyramid. Mm-hmm. Now, you could also use that point of view, it seems to me, to justify, again, which politicians you vote for. You could say, well, yeah, maybe someone, let's call him Schmonald Schmump, is a liar and an adulterer and has all these other things, but at least Schmonald Schmump is likely to, do something on the judicial branch of government that is going to speak to this other issue. Right. And, and by the way, it just turns out he also favors tax policies which are going to help rich people like me. I mean, you know what I mean? So I think that I'm not trying to be super duper cynical or say anything specific about people of religious faith, because I think all of us do this, right? We're all trying to find ways to persuade other people that when I endorse the people and propositions that I endorse, it's not because I'm selfish. It's because I'm, in fact, altruistic and right-thinking and generous and smart. And then it just so happens that by being right, generous, and smart, I wind up favoring all the policies that are somehow good for me.
Mm-hmm. Well, how does that type of insight play when thinking through something like affirmative action, the growing awareness around kind of white privilege, race consciousness, and things like that for in our contemporary setting?
Yeah, that's a great question. I've been thinking a little bit about that myself. And one of the things that I've been trying to think about, and I have these in private conversations, and it's sort of interesting to be talking to a philosopher at this, is that, when I talk to people about their ethical positions or political positions and so on, what I've been trying to do is get a sense of how people react to the idea that their moral stances ought to be principled. That they ought to be able to tell me, look, what is the principle by which you're endorsing a particular point of view? So if you're for or against affirmative action, tell me why. And then use that principle to break, to figure out what your position should be on some related but not exactly identical issue. And if you find yourself with the wrong position on that other piece, then you say, well, now I'm going to go back and revise my principle. And I think philosophers are super accustomed to this kind of approach, right? And lawyers are too. But my experience is that it's a really hard thing to get across to people. And what that does is by resisting that, people are permitting themselves to be inconsistent in their moral commitments with respect to particular issues. And look, if you as a philosopher have a way to persuade people to, endorse the idea that they ought to have a set of principles that they commit to, I'm all ears. But I do feel like that's possible. I feel like, we live in an age in which people are better educated than they ever have before. been before, that people are making their positions public in a way that they haven't before. And you put those two things together, and I feel like, maybe we can start asking people to be principled in their moral positions. But I, so far, have had, I think, relatively little success with that. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and one of the things both consistently experiencing that friction and parenting has made me realize is that Aristotle might have been more correct than I ever wanted him to be when it has or and a lot of the insights you get from Buddhism and mindfulness practice, that a lot of ethical reflection in the abstract imagines that humans are actual consistent rational agents or whatever, and then we've never met that person other than ourselves, right? Like, we're the only person we imagine to be that rational and internally consistent. And well, there was that one time we messed up, but that's when we doubted ourselves, right? Like,
Right.
we have that, like, we're great at spotting all the other people's, like when you talk about hypocrisy or moral failures or whatever, and less acting on it. One of the reasons I like philosophy is I try to, like, in a sense, you're trying to be as critical of yourself as you are of anyone else, which if you're good at spotting your own frailties, it gives you a certain level of compassion with everyone else.
Yeah. Right. I mean, there's that famous quote, Matthew, right? Why do you look at the speck of sawdust in your brother's eye and pay no attention to the plank in your own eye?
Yeah.
I think that's kind of what you're saying. And so I think that, not just Aristotle, but I think biblical, people there got it right too. And there's something about human nature. I mean, there's a reason that these different people got to the same conclusion, which is that there's something true about this idea that and that's of course where the title that you mentioned at the top of the show comes from, which is that we all sort of feel like no, we're perfectly consistent and whatever. And I like your point about when we don't quite live up to our own standards, we sort of like to say, well, look, I'm an X, but I just missed on that occasion, and look, I am the banner, I'm the poster child for this. I absolutely, I feel that way myself. Like, I acknowledge having made some errors of judgment in my life. And just like everyone else, what I do with that is I say, look, that doesn't define who I am. It's very possible to be a good person and have, made mistakes, moments of poor judgment from time to time. But that doesn't define your identity. And we don't think of that as having defined our identity. Now, other people will sometimes put that upon you. That is to say, other people, again, with the sawdust and the plank piece, right? So other people might only see the sawdust in their brother's eye and identify them that way. And this is human nature, right? And I think it's a super interesting point. And, since the dawn of time, people tried to figure out how we can, to some extent, help people see these things. And I think, again, to go back to Buddhism, I think that's part of it, right? Is that it starts to sort of endow you with a kind of wisdom to step back and say, oh, you know what? This notion of oneness with the universe, I think, is not in itself exactly where I come out on this, but to say, let's be wise about this and say, look, I'm a person, you're a person, we share this personness. And I think that does actually potentially start to build a culture of tolerance. It's just, in this country, that's not a super big part of the ethos.
Mm-hmm. Well, and even in America, I think that kind of early Enlightenment philosophy and its their concept of the self and rational choice and stuff what was secretly inserted into the Christian tradition, because like Paul says, he goes on this whole rant where he's like, well, what I want to do I don't do, and what I do I don't actually want to do. Who's going to free me from this body of death? Like, I act a fool and then I watch myself do it and go, that's horrible. And then there's like what God wants, that's more beautiful and graceful. And then I don't even do that, but I know I do it. And I'm supposed to be the one that's telling other people how to do it. Geez, I'm fucked. Like, he has this like awareness of how screwed up he is. And I think now, especially if you're wanting to judge the person, you see someone make a mistake and you just look at them and go, I wouldn't have done it. And there's this when I was in, this is only way a philosopher picks religious traditions, but when I was in college and had post-structuralist myself to death, and but yet I was in the South and was reading social science on the fruitfulness of participating in religious traditions and gathering regular across difference and cultivating practices of recognizing one's brokenness and having rituals for life transitions. I was like, I'm going to pick a religious tradition, even if, mythologically, whatever, like I just want to choose one that's practices are interesting. And when I came back and took my faith as a person of faith in Christianity seriously, it was because Jesus on the cross said, God forgive them, they don't know what they're doing. And yeah, if there's an ultimate reality, it should be loving and forgiving, but the clincher was they don't know what they're doing. Like, and if at any point anyone gets a chance to go like, you're completely wrong, it's when the innocent dude's being executed. And the response is Jesus recognizing the centurions kind of put up to it. I mean, like, look at this, like how this is all going down. And yeah, those religious leaders suck, but they're also protecting their privilege. And the only ones that get access to the privilege are the ones that work with Rome. That's how they got in charge of the temple. And like, you could see this sense that human beings are a realism about our brokenness. And I feel like if you can get that right, it gives you space to be honest about who you are and to start to have more responsibility.
Yeah, I think all of that is so deeply true, and I think in particular that point about the quotation from the cross is super important, because I actually think that many people, who do struggle with issues of anger and feelings of injustice and betrayal, I think one of the pathways, and you see this not just from the biblical literature, but also I think you see this in the clinical literature. So this is an idea that has been sort of a convergence between what you see in the Bible and in scientific psychology, which is exactly what you're saying, this wisdom to understand that in many cases, at least, this person who wronged you probably is not always the bad guy. They may not even have been doing what they were doing for malevolent reasons. They may have thought that they were, all of us typically think that we're on the side of angels. And occasionally we either fail in our ambitions or we have some beliefs that are just incorrect, which leads us down the maybe not most angelic pathway. And I think what you're pointing to is right, is that the wise person sees that and says, look, yeah, I was wronged, and this other person did something which I, feel was inappropriate or immoral or unethical or mean. But I also have to understand that person is a flawed human being too, and so it wasn't necessarily out of malevolence. There's all these great pieces about this. My former advisor, Lita Cosworth, used to quote that line that tragedy is good against good, and I think that we need to keep thinking about that. Is that when we see tragedy, we should try to find where the two good pieces are. Now, that's not always going to be the case. Sometimes it's good versus not so much. But I think we see this in other contexts too. One of my favorite videos, I'm not a big video guy, but there's this wonderful video recorded by a woman who was in the NSA. And I'll never forget how she put this. She says, look, I've been in the Middle East, I've been undercover, and they laugh at Americans because they love Star Wars so much, which is the story about the little rebels against the big empire. And, they're sitting there, they're like, wait a minute, but we're the rebels and you're the empire. How can you not understand what we're up to in the United States? It's like, you're Darth Vader and we are Luke Skywalker. And when you hear that self-portrayal of this conflict, I think, to me at least, that sheds this kind of light of wisdom, like, oh no, they think they're the good guys. And we think we're the good guys, because who wouldn't? You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm. No, I definitely think that's it happens. And the part of addressing that, for me, especially when working with students, is like when you read a conflict story like that, then see yourself as the one who needs to change. Or if you read any sacred text, like, don't read yourself as the one who's doing what God wants or is faithful to the Buddha's teaching. Like, see yourself as the one who's most problematized. And those type of practices are easier to do once you realize how conflicted a human naturally is. And that's one of the reasons I really liked the work on hypocrisy, because people love pointing out hypocrisy. It's there's nothing that brings people together if you're just meeting each other, like finding out who you both think are hypocrites and are better than. So, can you kind of give us an avenue into how you understand the notion of hypocrisy?
Yeah, so I mean, again, here I want to put on my academic hat for a second and just say that people use this word in slightly different contexts, and I think that's fine. So some people will refer to it simply to kind of point to any case in which someone is behaving unethically. I reserve it for a relatively narrow band of cases. So for me, a hypocrite is someone who says, hey, if you do X, or like doing X, Y, or Z is bad, like morally wrong, and then they themselves do X, Y, or Z. So it has to be a conflict between the category of stuff that you say is bad or condemn and then behavior. Again, people can use the term differently, and I think that's fine. But like some people would say it's hypocrisy if I say it's okay if I do X, but if you do X, it's wrong. And that's sort of, I think that's a neighbor of that kind of idea. And that's totally fine. And, and so I think when we look, if someone were to ask us what is the canonical case of hypocrisy, I don't know. I mean, these days with the current administration, with all due respect, I don't know who your listeners are, but some of us, when they read a tweet that says, Obama, what a horrible person for playing golf once a week, and then they themselves play golf 3 times a week, to me, that's a canonical case, right? So X was wrong, I do X. It's hard for me to imagine sort of a more kind of radiant, glowing case of hypocrisy, if you see what I'm saying.
Mm-hmm. Oh, yeah.
And I think, ultimately the one piece that people have missed, I think, about hypocrisy is, and I think this plugs into your point about how much people like finding a hypocrite and then condemning them, like, right, so you and I notice somebody, we're like, is because hypocrisy is really, as a philosophical matter, and you're an expert on this more than I, but it seems like ultimately it's coercion, because basically if I say X is wrong, what that really means is I'm going to punish you if you do X. And then I do it. So basically what I'm doing is I'm constraining your freedom while allowing myself to have that freedom. So it's just a form of saying I can do it, but you can't, which is just a form of what I think of as coercion or force. And that's ultimately why people are so irritated by it, is because no one wants other people to be able to force them to do, to do something they don't want to do. And that, in my opinion, is really what's at the heart of hypocrisy.
Mm-hmm. And I do think it does depend on the issue. Like the one I regularly get, in the last year I moved back to North Carolina after 10 years in Los Angeles. So it is a very different universe. And the number of people who continue to talk about Al Gore using an airplane is mind-numbing. I'm like, who thinks about Al Gore today? Like I mean, there are some people that act like Hillary's president, so I guess that shouldn't be surprising. But like, I think they're like, I've tried explaining, like, yeah, in the abstract, there's a million things we should all do, right? If you recognize climate change, and also if everybody did all of them and we didn't change structural things, it really wouldn't make a huge difference. And yet I tell myself that because I don't want to change some things, like eating beef or whatever. And so, like, but people will point out something like Al Gore rides airplanes and uses air conditioning. In the pointing out of hypocrisy in that sense is in a justification for them just to go and do it anyway. Right? Like, it's a way of deflecting a conversation away from whether or not we are setting our great grandkids up for a tempest, right? That's the thing. I'm like, when you're in those situations and you're trying to raise a particular issue, and hypocrisy is a conversation closer or stopper. Is there a way of dealing with that, or is it that tribal identity is already so activated, like that module so turned on that you're just going to hear that module spitting out reasons to not talk?
Yeah, great question. I mean, I wish, if I had the answer to that, I'd be famous, but I don't know what the right answer is. What part of the reason that I pointed to these things in my scholarly work was because I find them so vexing and so interesting, and there's really nothing to, like, there must be something we can do. What that looks like, I think, is really hard I just think it's super hard. As you're saying, you're getting at what I think of as the hard candy center of human nature. That stuff is in there deep. And, could I imagine some way that we could raise kids and, such that when they heard about someone else's hypocrisy, they didn't use that to justify their own? I don't know. I mean, I take the point. I've moved on this dimension in the sense that, as we were sort of talking about earlier, is that, I've been taking Robert Wright's book and Buddhist ideas more seriously about, and I do think there's something, and my friend, I should say, Shawnee Robbins, who's a clinician out in California, he's founded an institute that uses wisdom as part of its therapeutic techniques. And he's persuaded me that there's a power in wisdom, I think, that to some extent counteract some of these deep forces of human nature. And he's given me a kind of optimism that, if we did attain this kind of wisdom and did so at a younger age than some of us take to get anywhere close to it, even if they, in my case, who knows if I have or not, but then I think maybe there would be more scope for looking at ourselves a little bit more dispassionately, because that's part of that tradition, right? Is to step out and say, okay, well, I am the observer watching the experiencer. And I think, that might lead to a world that is a little bit more kind and understanding. But I don't know. The getting to that place, I think, is a profound challenge.
Mm-hmm. So the last question that I had was, coming out of your research and thinking about both the individual and their own struggles and then the societal ones, like, what's the question that you're carrying around you don't know the answer to, but is so energizing, you hope to get to a place you have 200 pages to talk about it?
That's a great question. Well, I mean, this is maybe the good time, since this is the last question anyway, to let you, to come clean and say, I just completed a master's of public administration degree, and I'm exiting the academy. And so much of my, prior attention to unraveling mysteries of the universe is sort of diminishing as I move into the next phase of my career, which is going to be aimed more at this question of how can we use public policy to make people's lives better? How can we improve people's outcomes and decisions and structures by changing the laws and rules that govern them? And so I'm still curious about these issues, but I myself am probably going to be paying less attention. But I think to answer that, I would probably go back to a point I made earlier, which is I'm super interested in this question of just how to get people to think about their moral commitments and principles. Because I think that for many people, they're in there somewhere, they're implicit in much of what they talk about. But there's a certain reluctance to apply them broadly. And I think for me, a big question is, and this plugs right into this notion of wisdom, is how can we get people to reflect? And that includes me. I'm not trying to, by any means claim to be a being of light with perfect moral clarity. I think part of this is to understand that there's always going to be imperfections, flaws, and our moral development is always an ongoing process. It's never a destination. It's always a journey. And my question is about, what kind of light can we shed on people's journeys to allow them to think as carefully as they care to about what their principles are and how those principles are interacting with who they are and the very core of their identity. And I'll just part with this sort of idea about why I think that's important. I think that people ought to be dissuaded from doing things that harm other people. And I think that that's a perfectly legitimate part of who we are as humans. But when I look at the world, and I think you were pointing to this with social media and with the political discourse, I see a lot of anger. I see a lot of emotion. And as part of that, I see a lot of what looks like a willing participation in a kind of mob psychology that gives voice to that anger, which otherwise might be suppressed in a more personable environment. And this goes to your point about our social worlds as well. And I think that represents a relatively serious danger in a way that people who are interested in trying to make the world a better place could focus less on. I think that obviously preventing people from doing bad things is a really important part of who we are. But I think preventing people from mobbing on people who they from bullying, from harassing. I think that's somewhere that we haven't looked at. We haven't looked at that enough, and I think that's an area that I'm super interested in trying to understand, particularly in the digital age, where it's so easy to get into a sort of a whirlwind of anger, and those frenzies, I think, have very toxic consequences.
Oh yeah, yeah. So the one thing that came to mind is, how would you describe that turning point where you decide to go get another master's degree and redirect your life? I know it's a lot of adults have that, where they, shift vocational focus and stuff, but probably even more think about doing it and then don't.
That's a great question, and I'm going to go back to the beginning of our conversation. So one thing I left out of my answer to your question about my early kind of childhood and how I came into science was that, I was an avid reader of science fiction as a kid, and this is going to be shocking to people who know me, but it turns out I was a pretty nerdy kid, like pretty geeky, and I spent a lot of time at the public library taking out science fiction books. And as part of that process, I came to the belief that science was the solution to the universe's problems. The scientist was always the hero; they always saved the world through either clever thinking or technological innovation. And that ultimately was a huge force in pushing me into science. And I did that for 25 years. I did science in part because I thought I could make the world a better place. And as part of that training, I was exposed to economics and political science, and the child's belief in the power of science to change the universe turned into what I think is a more realistic view that in the modern world, what changes is policies, politics, and laws. And those are the things that are really moving around people's behavior and can really aid those who need help the most. That it's not going to be a technological innovation that lifts people out of poverty, although for goodness sakes, that has been true. Like certainly agricultural innovations and energy innovations have had that effect worldwide. But in this country, we have more than enough food and shelter for everybody to have a home and to have as much as they want to eat. Like, that's not the problem. The problem is how we organize ourselves. Mm-hmm. And so to me, the scientific piece of this has become less interesting to me than the policy piece. And it's those policy levers that are going to, I think, lift up the least fortunate into lives that are more fulfilling and happier ones.
That's awesome. Well, I hope you are so successful at it. Later, people listen to the end of this and are like, oh, so there was a time they struggled with all that. That's interesting. Yeah. So thank you so much for hanging out on the internet.
Well, thank you so much, Tripp. This has been, I have to say, I really admire how prepared you were for this interview. You seem obviously really interested in it and you knew everything about it. So it's been an absolute pleasure chatting with you today.
Awesome. Well, and if there's ever another reason for us to talk and you come up with the most exciting policy that we should all organize. There's about 30,000 progressive people of faith that listen, that are working congregations. So I'm more than happy to tell them and let them know about something they can advocate for, write letters for and stuff, because complaining is the only thing I don't really like encouraging.
That sounds wonderful. And I'll absolutely be in touch if that moment comes.
All right.